During college, my aunt secretly rented the apartment my grandma gave me and kept $60,000 over time. When I found out, I called an attorney who told me, "That's a felony." Soon after, police arrived at her house. My grandma passed away with a grin still on her face, and yeah, I know how corny that sounds, like something off a greeting card rack, but it honestly happened that way. She was stretched out in a hospital bed, her body worn down until her bones looked like piano keys under the sheets, smiling like she'd cracked some kind of universal punchline the rest of us were too dumb to hear. She squeezed my hand and told me to listen close, warning me that this city would try its best to chew me up and spit me out, and that's why she was leaving me somewhere safe to land. At the time, I was a junior at State, barely keeping my head above water in organic chemistry, soaked in anxiety and sweat while it felt like everyone else already had their lives mapped out. Trying to wrap my mind around the fact that only the second person who'd ever truly given a damn about me was calmly getting ready for whatever came after this life was way beyond what I could handle. She told me about the apartment on Willow Street, her voice thinning out as she listed it off like an inventory report. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, corner unit, hardwood floors, paperwork waiting on her desk, all of it already in my name and legally mine since I turned 18. That birthday came back to me clear as day, a Tuesday night at Olive Garden, her sliding an envelope across the table that felt way too serious for a place known for endless breadsticks. She'd told me then that it was paid in full, no mortgage, no debt, mine outright, and she made me repeat it back to her, so she knew I understood it was free and clear. I nodded back then and again in the hospital because I didn't know how else to arrange my face for something that heavy. She coughed hard and warned me not to let anyone take it away from me. Not my mother, not my aunt, not anybody who smelled weakness and thought they were owed a piece. 2 days later, she was gone. The funeral was exactly the kind of scene that makes people mutter that she would have hated all the attention, and I believed it. My Aunt Linda kept touching Grandma's arm like she was double-checking that death had really stuck, and my mom cried with the intensity of someone auditioning for the role of grief itself. I stood there in a borrowed suit, thinking about hardwood floors and how I was about to technically own property while not even owning a decent winter coat. After the reception, I went back to Grandma's house to get the documents, and the deed was tucked into a manila folder alongside a handwritten note that read, "For safety, for dignity, for the day you realize your family sees your future, but not your worth." And that line hit me hard enough that I read it 3 times before stuffing everything into my backpack and heading back to campus. For the next year and a half, the apartment barely crossed my mind because I was too busy just trying to survive, juggling classes, a minimum wage bookstore job, and the chaos of being 21 with no supervision for the first time. The place existed in my head like money in a savings account you're scared to check because you don't want to know the truth. Then I graduated, and Aunt Linda called me. She opened with "sweetheart" in that syrupy tone she used when she was about to pitch something, saying she needed to talk about my grandmother's apartment. I was sitting in my dorm room surrounded by empty walls and boxes of old textbooks when I asked what about it, and she launched into her explanation like an actress stepping into a spotlight, telling me I'd been so focused on school and that the building had been sitting empty, which she said was dangerous because empty places attract squatters and vandals. I stayed quiet while she explained she'd been renting it out for me, supposedly to cover taxes and utilities and keep it maintained, framing it all as some thoughtful surprise she planned to reveal after graduation. The way she said it made it sound like a present instead of a confession. I stopped her and asked if she was saying she'd been renting out my apartment, and she corrected me fast, calling it our apartment and claiming it technically belonged to Grandma's estate, with her and my mom as co-executors. I cut her off and told her Grandma left it to me, that I had the deed with my name on it, and the silence that followed was the kind where you can practically hear someone calculating their odds. I asked how much rent she'd collected, and after another heavy pause she said it was in an account for maintenance, dodging the number until I pushed again. With a sigh like I was being rude, she tossed out $30,000 over the years, then backpedaled and admitted it could be more, maybe 40, 50, even 60,000. I told her I needed to see the books, and she immediately suggested dinner first, trying to calm me down like I was a child who couldn't be trusted to think straight. So I ended the call without drama, just pressed the button like closing an annoying pop-up online. When I finally went to see the building, it felt smaller than memory, Not because it shrank, but because I'd grown up enough to realize childhood spaces always lie to you. It was a brick corner building doing its best to look respectable while losing the fight to chipped paint, a sagging gutter, and weeds that had fully claimed the flower beds, with the porch light off in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. I still had the key, which surprised me more than it should have, something I'd carried around for years like an expired ID, and when I used it the lock turned easily, and the door opened onto a hallway that smelled like someone else's dinner. The apartment upstairs matched Grandma's description exactly, 2 bedrooms and 1 bath, but the hardwood floors were scarred from years of careless living, furniture gouges, mystery stains, and that lingering scent of strangers who never treated the place like home. The bay windows felt aggressive, the kitchen looked frozen in the 1990s, and the bathroom had surrendered completely to mold. Standing there in the living room with a duffel bag holding almost everything I owned, I felt something click inside me, not sadness or pure anger, but that delayed jolt you get when you touch something burning hot and your brain finally catches up to the pain. My aunt had been pulling rent out of that place the whole time, $60,000 in total, while I was living off ramen, cycling through the same 3 shirts, taking on student loans, and working weekends at a bookstore for $7.50 an hour, and she never said a word. The morning after it finally hit me, I called a lawyer, not some shiny firm with glass walls and partner names etched on the door, because that wasn't even remotely in my price range, but a legal clinic on 5th Street that helped regular people with real problems. The paralegal who picked up my case was a woman named Carol, and she had this sharp, no-nonsense energy that made it obvious why she worked at a free clinic instead of a high-rise office. I handed her the deed, the folder my grandma gave me, and the text messages from my aunt explaining herself, and Carol went through everything slowly, glasses slipping down her nose while she hummed to herself. When she finally looked up at me, she told me straight that it was bad, that my grandmother left the property to me outright with no wiggle room, meaning I owned it completely, and that my aunt had been collecting rent without permission, without my knowledge, and almost certainly without reporting it as income. I told her I didn't know anything about my aunt's taxes, and Carol nodded and said that was fine because what mattered was that this qualified as fraud, probably theft, possibly wire fraud, and that the unreported income was the part that really made it serious. When I asked what she meant by serious, she clarified that the IRS absolutely loves situations like this, because once money's being skimmed and hidden, it stops being a family issue and becomes a federal one. My stomach dropped, and I asked her what I was supposed to do. She leaned back in her squeaky chair and told me to document everything, collect lease agreements, bank statements, and proof of ownership, then file a police report because someone was stealing from me, and the fact that it was my aunt only made it worse since betrayal was baked into it. I walked out with a checklist and a business card for a forensic accountant, but before any of that, I knew I had to confront my aunt directly. I called Linda and asked to meet, and she immediately suggested lunch in that overly sweet tone she used when she thought she was already winning, naming some trendy downtown place with good salads. We met at a restaurant full of reclaimed wood and loud millennial confidence, and she was already seated when I arrived, sipping white wine at 11:45 in the morning. She looked smaller than I remembered, older around the eyes, but the expression was unchanged, that practiced charm of someone who learned early that smiling could smooth over almost anything. She stood up to hug me and told me how grown I looked, and I sat down without responding. She pointed to a plate and told me she'd ordered a grilled chicken salad because I always liked salad, and I told her I needed the accounting records for the apartment, all of them, bank statements, leases, everything. She placed her wine glass down slowly, like she was setting a chess piece, and told me we should talk about it later and eat first, and I told her no, that I wanted the records now or an explanation for where $60,000 went. She blinked a couple times, and I could see her running numbers in her head, testing how much I knew and how hard I might push. She called the number an exaggeration, and when I asked for the real amount, she admitted it was $62,000 over 4 years. I asked her what exactly she thought that was if not theft, and the woman at the next table turned to stare as Linda leaned in and dropped her voice, telling me she'd kept the property in good shape, screened tenants, handled repairs, and spent her own time and money doing me a favor. She accused me of stealing her effort by calling it theft, mocked me for playing college kid while she protected my future, and said she could have let the place rot instead. Something cold settled in my chest as I told her again that I wanted full access to every record or I'd call a lawyer, which made her laugh and remind me we were family and didn't drag lawyers into family business. I told her then to give me the records by Friday or I'd go to the police, stood up without touching the salad, and walked out while I could feel her watching me, already rewriting the story in her head for my mother. Friday passed with no records, just a call from my mom demanding to know why I was threatening Linda over money she said was help. I told her plainly that Linda stole from me, managed my property without permission, and hid income from the IRS. And after a long pause, my mom said Linda had always been generous and accused me of treating her like a criminal. I told her that was because she was one, that theft and tax evasion weren't misunderstandings, and when she dismissed me as a kid who didn't understand the world, I hung up, not angry, just clear-headed, exhausted from explaining wrongdoing to people who preferred to call it family business. On Monday morning, I walked into the police station and asked to file a report, and the officer who sat with me was Detective Harris, a man in his late 50s whose tired eyes made it clear he'd heard every lie imaginable and stopped being impressed a long time ago. He listened without interrupting while I explained everything: my grandma's death, the apartment deed with my name on it, and how my Aunt Linda had been collecting rent for 4 years without ever telling me or asking permission. He finally asked if I had proof, flipping open a notepad, and I told him I had bank statements showing deposits, lease agreements with tenant names, and text messages where she admitted to taking the money. He nodded and wrote it all down, then told me plainly that this qualified as theft, unauthorized use of property, and likely fraud, adding that the tax side made it complicated because that crossed into federal territory, but they could still move forward with state charges. When I asked what happened next, he said they'd build a case, need all my documentation, and then contact my aunt for her version of events. And when I muttered that she was family, he said quietly that family theft was the worst kind because it wasn't just about money, it was about betrayal, which was exactly what I felt. Linda got a call from a detective 3 days later, and that same afternoon my mother called me in a panic disguised as anger, demanding to know what I'd done and yelling that the police were investigating her sister and asking if I understood what I'd done to the family. I told her I'd reported a crime, and she shot back that I'd humiliated everyone, that the neighbors knew, her workplace knew, and how could I do this to Linda and to them? I told her Linda did this to herself by stealing, and when she said Linda was only helping, I cut her off and told her to stop calling it help, because taking money from me while I was struggling wasn't generosity, it was predatory. My mom made a sound that landed somewhere between a laugh and a sob and told me my grandmother would be ashamed of me. And I thought about Grandma's last warning not to let anyone take what she'd left me, so I said no, she wouldn't be. The next call came from an IRS agent named Karen Wu, who explained that my police report had triggered a federal investigation because the IRS doesn't play around with unreported income, and 4 years of hidden rental money was exactly their kind of problem. She told me they'd need copies of all the lease agreements, bank statements, and written communication, and when I said I had everything, she told me my aunt would receive a notice and have 30 days to file amended returns or face an audit that could lead to penalties, interest, and possible prosecution, which made it clear this wasn't a family argument anymore. It was real. 2 weeks later, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and a woman introduced herself as attorney Melissa Grant, saying my Aunt Linda had hired her and wanted to discuss a possible settlement. I asked if she meant a settlement for theft, and the lawyer carefully said her client admitted she'd handled things informally, but claimed her intentions were always to help me, and that she was willing to return all the rent and compensate me for emotional distress. I told her I didn't want a settlement and wanted charges filed, and after a pause she warned that legal action could be expensive and embarrassing for everyone, which I said my aunt should have considered before stealing $62,000. Then I hung up. That night my phone filled with messages from relatives I barely spoke to. Cousin Mark telling me this was out of line and family forgives mistakes. Aunt Susan saying I was tearing everyone apart over money. Uncle Ray insisting Grandma would want forgiveness. So I muted the whole thread and called Carol at the legal clinic. I told her they were offering restitution, and she said of course they were, because once the IRS shows up, everyone suddenly wants things to disappear quietly. And when I asked if I should take it, she told me that what mattered was that my aunt knew it was wrong, did it for 4 years, and only stopped because she got caught, which wasn't a mistake, but a pattern. I thought about how long it had gone on, how many tenants had lived in my apartment without my knowledge, and how many rent checks had gone into her account while I was taking out loans, and I told Carol I was letting the legal process run its course. The IRS filed charges in July, and the police followed with state charges in August, and my Aunt Linda, a well-liked volunteer and neighborhood helper, was suddenly facing federal tax evasion and state theft charges that even made the local news. My mother stopped calling, my relatives went silent, and the quiet felt less like punishment and more like freedom. I moved into the apartment in September, finally occupying something that was mine both on paper and in reality. Hired a contractor to refinish the hardwood floors, repaint the walls something better than depressing beige, and deal with the mold in the bathroom, using money I'd saved from the bookstore because I wasn't waiting anymore. One afternoon, watching the floors get sanded down, I thought about Grandma's note about safety, dignity, and family seeing your future, but not your worth, and I realized she'd known exactly what might happen and left me shelter from it. And as I stood there in that apartment, I was finally standing inside it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I'd seen enough courtroom shows to expect something impressive, soaring ceilings and polished wood that made you feel like justice itself lived there. But instead it was just a room with flickering fluorescent lights, beige walls, and a judge's bench that looked like it had been ordered out of a catalog for government offices, the whole place feeling less like history and more like a DMV that happened to echo better. My Aunt Linda sat at the defendant's table wearing a navy suit that was clearly chosen to make her look harmless and sincere, and she'd lost weight in that tight, hollow-waist dress does to people. Her hair styled differently too, the kind of careful look that says money was spent to appear trustworthy. Her lawyer, Melissa Grant, sat beside her, sharp haircut, sharper eyes, the kind of woman who looked like she'd defended far worse people and slept just fine afterward. Detective Harris was seated a few rows behind me, and Karen Wu from the IRS was there as well, calmly taking notes like she was cataloging proof of the end times. The judge, a woman named Eleanor Price, which felt ironic in its own way, carried herself like someone who'd spent decades on the bench and stopped being surprised by human behavior sometime early in her career. She opened the session by stating this court was hearing the case of the state versus Linda Watkins, listing the charges as theft of property, unauthorized use of real estate, and fraud, then asked how the defendant pleaded. Melissa Grant stood and announced a plea of not guilty, starting to frame it as a misunderstanding over informal property management, before Judge Price cut her off without even looking up and said that would be addressed later and instructed the prosecution to begin. The prosecutor, a woman named Rachel Moore in her mid-40s, had the same tired eyes as the detective, the look of someone who'd heard every excuse imaginable and believed none of them, and she guided me through my testimony step by step, covering the deed, the apartment, the 4 years I didn't know it was being rented, the lunch confrontation, and all the documentation. She asked if my aunt ever asked permission to rent the apartment, and I said no. If she ever offered to share the income, and again I said no. If she ever told me the apartment was occupied, and I said no, adding that I didn't even know the place existed until after I graduated. Rachel nodded and returned to her seat, and then Melissa stood for cross-examination, asking if I'd ever visited the property during those 4 years, which I hadn't, and whether I'd tried to contact my aunt about my grandmother's property, which I explained I didn't do because I didn't know it was something I was responsible for and no one had told me. Melissa pushed, reminding me my aunt was family and asking if I found it strange that no one mentioned such a valuable asset. And I told her flatly that what I found strange was my aunt collecting $62,000 from my property without telling me. She shifted tactics and brought up tenant statements praising my aunt for being responsive and professional, and I answered that she'd been acting as a landlord for property she didn't own and collecting money she had no right to take, which prompted an objection that the judge overruled, saying I was answering the question. The trial ran 3 days, and on the second day my aunt took the stand, calm and composed, telling a story about helping her nephew, preserving an investment that would have fallen apart without her, and insisting she always planned to give me the money once the time was right, claiming she was protecting my future and would never intentionally hurt me. Rachel's cross-examination was precise and brutal, asking if my aunt ever told me about the rentals, which she hadn't, if she told my mother, which she hadn't, and finally whether she reported the income on her tax returns, at which point my aunt deferred to her attorney and stopped answering, prompting a smile from Rachel that said everything. On the final day, the IRS presented their case, with Karen Wu walking through financial records that showed $62,000 in rental income never appearing on tax filings year after year, clearly laid out as income received, income hidden, income not reported, and she testified plainly that intent didn't matter because the law required it to be disclosed. Melissa objected repeatedly, but the evidence was airtight: bank deposits, leases, text messages where my aunt admitted the arrangement, leaving no room for confusion, only a deliberate choice to take money that wasn't hers and keep quiet about it. The judge took 2 days to deliberate, and when she returned, she looked directly at my aunt while reading the verdict, finding her guilty on theft, guilty on unauthorized use of property, and guilty on fraud, and what I felt wasn't victory or satisfaction but a deep, settling relief, the kind that comes when reality finally matches the truth you've been carrying alone. Judge Price announced sentencing would happen in 30 days and ordered my aunt remanded to court custody pending recommendations, and my aunt looked stunned, while her lawyer jumped up talking about appeals and community reputation. But the judge was finished listening and brought the gavel down like the conversation, and that was that. Judge Price cleared her throat and said that Linda Watkins would be sentenced according to federal guidelines for tax evasion, state guidelines for theft, and the full scope of what she'd done, adding that the court had seen zero real remorse, only repeated attempts to downplay the damage. 30 days later, sentencing happened, and my aunt was given 3 years in federal prison for tax evasion, plus 2 years concurrent for theft and fraud, which meant with good behavior, she'd probably serve a little over 2 years total. The judge read a short statement that boiled down to this idea that family ties don't give anyone permission to steal, that the law doesn't bend for blood, and neither does basic respect. My mom didn't show up for sentencing, and neither did most of the family, leaving just Detective Harris, Karen Wu from the IRS, the prosecutor, and me sitting there when it was over. I walked out into the hallway afterward and heard my aunt's lawyer already talking about appeals and injustice, but I didn't stick around to listen because there was nothing left to debate. Linda reported to a federal prison camp in Ohio about 6 weeks later, which I found out through a cousin who'd seen a Facebook post that disappeared almost immediately. It was minimum security, so it wasn't like she was being sent to some nightmare facility, but she was still locked up, and that mattered. About a week after she went in, I went back to the apartment, and it finally looked like a place someone could live instead of a crime scene. With refinished floors, soft gray walls Grandma would have approved of, and a bathroom that no longer smelled like neglect. Standing in the living room by the window that faced Willow Street, I thought about all the nights my aunt had slept comfortably somewhere else while strangers lived in my home, all the rent checks that showed up in her name, and all the stories she told herself to justify it. My phone buzzed with a text from my mom saying my aunt wanted me to visit her in prison, and I stared at that message for a long time before putting my phone away, because some lines, once you draw them, aren't meant to be erased. Life kept moving in that strange way where everything changes but nothing really does, and I lived in the apartment, worked days at the bookstore, and started picking up freelance design jobs at night, discovering I had skills I'd never bothered to notice before, and that the internet is full of people willing to pay you if you do good work and don't over-explain yourself. The money slowly built up, not enough to feel rich, but enough to feel safe, enough that I stopped bracing for impact all the time. My mom called once in a while, and our conversations stayed polite and distant, like two people who used to be close and now just exchanged proof of life, neither of us apologizing, neither of us asking for one, just existing in separate lanes. About 6 months later, my cousin Emily called me, the only family member who'd reached out after the trial, and said I did the right thing without attaching conditions, and she told me she was getting married and wanted me there as an actual guest, not the person people whispered about. I asked if my aunt would be there even though I already knew the answer, and Emily said no, that Linda was still in Ohio, and that she'd cut off most of that side of the family anyway, because they kept pushing her to forgive and pressure me to drop the appeals, which had worn her down. I apologized, and Emily told me not to be sorry but to be happy, saying I chose myself, and that she was trying to learn how to do the same. I went to the wedding, which was small and held in a park and full of people who genuinely seemed to like each other, and I brought a date named Alex who I'd met in a coffee shop line, a woman with a dog, a nonprofit job, and a blunt honesty that felt grounding instead of judgmental. On the drive there, Alex asked if my aunt really stole from me and went to prison, and when I said yes and explained my family thought I was wrong for reporting it, she shook her head and said my family was insane, which was oddly comforting. At the wedding, I didn't feel like a villain or a problem, just someone who'd made a hard call and lived through it. 2 years into living in the apartment, I got a letter from the federal prison, and it was from Linda, her handwriting smaller and tighter, like something inside her had shrunk. She wrote that she'd been thinking about what she did, that therapy was mandatory but had forced her to be honest, and that she'd realized she was angry at me for being smarter, for having more potential, for Grandma seeing something in me she never saw in her, and that she'd told herself she was helping when she was really just taking from me to soothe her own bitterness. I read that part 3 times before moving on to where she said she wasn't asking for forgiveness and didn't expect it, only that she needed to say the truth out loud, that she robbed me not just of money but of trust, and that was the real crime. I set the letter down and didn't touch it again for a week, and when I finally wrote back, I kept it short, telling her I needed to hear that she understood what she'd done, that I didn't forgive her yet, but maybe someday I would, not for her sake, but for mine. 3 years later, Linda was released from prison, having served her time and paid her debt in the way the system measures those things, coming out on probation, without a job, divorced while she was inside, and returning to a world that remembered her as the woman who stole from her nephew. I didn't hear from her directly, but my mom mentioned once that Linda was trying to rebuild her life and hoped the family could move forward, and I let that sit where it was without picking it up. I chose not to answer that at all and put my energy into what was actually in front of me, the apartment with its restored hardwood floors, the freelance design business I'd built from scratch, and Jamie, who'd become my partner in the truest sense, the kind who knew every ugly detail of my past and stayed anyway. I had a life now that ran on my rules, supported by my own income, rooted in a place that had been meant for me long before I understood its value. 5 years after the trial, an email landed in my inbox from a documentary filmmaker who said my case had somehow turned into an internet obsession, with threads blowing up on Reddit, short videos all over TikTok, and strangers debating family betrayal, boundaries, and paperwork like it was sport. My story had turned into a warning label for trusting the wrong people, and the filmmaker wanted to interview me so it could maybe help others who were being quietly robbed by people they loved. I agreed. Filming took 3 days, and they shot most of it inside the apartment on Willow Street, the place where everything started, collapsed, and eventually rebuilt itself. They talked to Detective Harris about how family theft cuts deeper than most crimes, and they interviewed Karen Wu from the IRS, who laid out the financial side in blunt, uncomfortable detail. They even spoke with my Aunt Marlene, and she looked older than I remembered, the kind of aging prison accelerates, stealing more than just years. She talked about guilt, therapy, resentment, and how she'd convinced herself that control and theft were the same thing as care. When the documentary was released, it went viral in that strange modern way where millions of strangers suddenly feel entitled to your worst memories. My inbox filled with messages from people thanking me for giving them permission to cut off toxic relatives, mixed with others telling me I was cruel, unforgiving, or disloyal to family. Some called me brave, others called me a traitor, and I read just enough of it to understand that no matter what you do, people will always project their own damage onto your choices. 10 years after my grandma Rose passed away, I stood alone in the apartment and took stock of my life, noticing how the floors were still beautiful, the walls had been repainted twice, the bathroom renovated again because bathrooms never stopped demanding attention, and how I'd filled the place with bookshelves, art, and the quiet evidence of a real home. Jamie had moved in for good, and we were talking about buying another property someday, something with room for a garden, and about marriage, dogs, and a future that felt solid because it was built on honesty instead of guilt. Marlene had reached out a handful of times over the years with apologies and requests for forgiveness, and I'd answered politely but firmly, wishing her well, while making it clear I didn't want a relationship, because some breaks don't get repaired, they just get left behind. My relationship with my mother settled into a careful distance, polite conversations at Sophie's birthday parties, the occasional text, sad in the quiet way truth often is, because she'd chosen a version of loyalty that didn't include believing me, and that choice had consequences. I think sometimes about what Grandma Rose would say if she could see how it all turned out, not the trial or the prison sentence or the family fallout, but the apartment, the life I built inside it, and the fact that I finally claimed what was mine instead of letting someone else decide my worth. I imagine her smiling and saying that was always the point, and I know now she was never just talking about property. She was teaching me that I was worth protecting.